Greetings, my ghoulish friends. You do not realize what you have stumbled upon. This is a place for the dead. A place where fiends appear in the dark, where creatures are lurking behind every corner. A place where monsters appear. Still with us? Then come with me if you dare, as we bring you the story of the Undying Monsters.
Love monster movies. Since I was a little kid, it was the only genre for me.
I love all sorts of different kinds of movies, specifically horror and sci-fi as well.
I've always been a big fan of monsters in general, and blood and guts.
I think anybody who has an active imagination toward the fantastic, toward the grotesque, whether it's science fiction or horror or fantasy, Lord of the Rings, I think people like that are introduced to either these subjects through books, stories, or films, and they can't get enough of it. I'd say the most famous horror movie ever made is Frankenstein. That makeup, created by Jack Pierce, worn by Boris Karloff, is still probably the most recognized makeup in the history of movies.
Whenever a kid thinks of Frankenstein, he thinks of the original Frankenstein with the flat head and bolts coming out of his neck and his arms stiff as rods in front of him.
Everyone's going to know who Frankenstein, because, your parents know, your friends know. It's, you see dolls of them, you see it mimicked on TV. It's just a piece of culture now.
Boris Karloff, to me, is probably the best, and his performance as the Frankenstein monster and Bride of Frankenstein, really, it's enough to bring you tears. And only a great actor like Karloff could have made you feel something, because years later when other actors would play him, he kind of just became this stumbling cliche. But when Karloff played him, you really cared about him.
Another famous monster movie, which wasn't an actor, but a small model, was King Kong.
But I think my favorite of all time has to be the original King Kong. And I was probably 6 when I first saw it. And it was wonderful because you really identified with this poor creature.
King Kong, the original King Kong. I think that it's a tour de force in imagination on film.
Perfect movie, beautifully scored, paced, very unique. Holds up today, I think.
I was so obsessed with this character, King Kong, that when I was 7 years old, on Thanksgiving, 1971, my mother took me to New York, and I actually climbed to the top of the Empire State Building, and I stood there on top on Thanksgiving night, and it was a very emotional experience for me because of that movie.
That adventuring, pioneering attitude that was very prevalent in America in the 1930s, that we can go and discover new things that no one has ever found before.
They kidnapped him from the island, and you really want him to have a nice, happy ending. And it was such a tragic ending on top of the Empire State Building. And every time I'd see that movie, I knew how it would end. And I always would wish that it would end differently. But it still, to this day, is my favorite monster movie of all time.
I always collected things. I collected marbles when I was a kid. I collected toy soldiers. I collected comic books. And as you grew up, you had to sort of say, hey, it's time to put these things away. It's kind of childish.
You always wanted to collect stuff because you would see the movie and just wanted to buy the stuff.
It's an extension of the movie. It's something that you can take with you. It's something that, you can show to the world that you enjoy.
For me, it's a way to immerse myself in those worlds more and to understand them better, and hopefully understand not only the filmmaker's intentions, but maybe their unintentional intentions, those little subconscious things that they do because it's art.
I think people that have an interest in horror films or collecting horror film memorabilia or any kind of memorabilia. It's their way of becoming closer to the films that they weren't able to be on the set of.
I had every monster poster on my wall, and it made you feel like you had something to do with it. You know, beyond the movies, you just wanted pictures of the things. It made you feel like they were always around.
In 1960, when I was about 12 years old, I was in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I saw this magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland. It had to do with monster movies. I said, wow, this is interesting. And that got me started.
When I was a kid, I had this monster magazine, and any kid like you that made the models always read Famous Monsters.
I wanted to see more of them. I wanted to read everything I could. I wanted to learn everything about them. And in those days, there was no Google. There were no bookstores where you could just go in and find books. There was virtually nothing on them. The first books on horror films hadn't even been written yet.
So you had to read the monster movie through the magazine. And this would be the thing. Once you would read the magazine, it would make you want to see the movie, and you'd have to wait till it came on television.
With me, it was like picking up TV Guide on Tuesday night and looking to see what movies were going to be on channels 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11.
Things are so easy for kids now, but back in the 60s and 70s, you actually had to wait months and months, sometimes years, to see a monster movie that you were dying to see because of the magazine.
I don't know where I would be if I wasn't able to just pick up a horror movie down, go rent one or make one or see one on any channel I wanted.
And generally, in those days, films like Giant from the Unknown, She-Demons, Plan 9 from Outer Space, all this basically dreck that had been done from the 50s and the 40s and the 60s, they were on constantly because they were cheap and inexpensive films. But the Universal films, like Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and so forth, were virtually hardly ever on.
The only Hunchback that I ever saw was the Charles Laughton version, which was on television like 3 or 4 times a year. But I really wanted to see the movie they detailed in the magazine, the Anthony Quinn Hunchback.
And so if they were on and you saw that they were coming up, my gosh, it would be like, that's going to be on 2 o'clock on Halloween night on Channel 2, and it's a school night. And so you'd beg your parents a week ahead, please, let me stay up and see this, whatever it took.
And this was never on, ever. And finally, it was going to be on Channel 7 at 7:30. And I was so excited. I was like 9 years old. And it just happened to be the same week that Nixon resigned. And all of a sudden, the news came on, and there was no Hunchback. And I was absolutely devastated. And I had to wait till like 5 years later. It was on the 3:30 movie on Channel 7. And I just loved it, But that was a just devastating time for me, as I remember.
That's the kind of experience it was. Everything was like a special thing. Every magazine that came out, every book that came out, every movie in a theater that came out, it was a special thing. Forey Ackerman's contribution to monster filmdom, shall we say, cannot be really understated.
He was brought up by his grandparents, who allowed him to watch an obscene amount of horror movies every day.
He was the guy who would write these articles in the monster magazines. That was his magazine. You would immediately just associate Forrest Ackerman with these monster magazines. And he'd bring people into his house, and he had every single kind of prop from every monster movie, whether it was like the Brontosaurus from King Kong or Dracula's ring. And you could take tours of this house, but he was a guy that just never really grew up and just loved monsters.
Everyone knows who he is, from Stephen King to Steven Spielberg. And I think that he has been such a huge influence on the genres as a whole. I mean, they wouldn't exist as they do today without Forrest Ackerman.
He was approached by a publisher in 1957 who wanted to do a monster magazine as a one-shot. We'll put it out there, that'll be it. And it was called Famous Monsters of Filmland. And Forey knew a lot about this. He had been a science fiction editor and an agent for decades, and a fan going back to the 20s and 30s. So when James Warren, the publisher, asked him to do this, they put out the magazine, and it came out in the cold months of February of 1958, and it just took off. I mean, it was an instant success.
Since it was his monster magazine, the monster magazine was always around when I was a kid. I mean, there was nothing like, my dad would take me to the newsstand, and if you saw new Famous Monsters out, it was just the greatest feeling.
And so the kids were amused by this. And while he was like a wonderful teacher, the kind of perfect teacher that would bring humor to the subject matter, and you were already interested in the subject matter.
Forrest Ackerman made this magazine, and you felt that he was just writing it to you. And I loved it. It was just my favorite thing as a kid. I didn't really read comic books, but Famous Monsters, that was it.
Well, I thought for 200 issues that I was just entertaining youngsters, perhaps educating them somewhat, but I never dreamed that they would morph into Stephen King and Steven Spielberg and John Landis and George Lucas, and I'm quite overwhelmed to find that I did all that unwittingly.
So there you have it, my ghoulish friends. The story of the Undying Monsters. Sleep tight. Don't let the bed bugs bite.
Forey's contribution is incredible. I mean, he's been around for almost 90 years. No, actually 90 if you count today. And Forey is, Forey's the man who brought monsters into the homes of many children through Famous Monsters of Filmland.
Well, my Forey story is fairly well known, at least among my friends, that I was a childhood reader of Famous Monsters magazine. It was one of my favorite things when I was a kid.
I'm sitting on top of the world, just rolling along, singing a song.